So just about 2 days ago, Dax Shepard acknowledged publicly with a ton of humility, courage, and honesty to the whole world that he recently relapsed, or that I guess I wouldn't say recently, but he had been in a relapse on painkillers. And this isn't too long after he recently celebrated, or I guess his family and friends recently celebrated his 16 years of sobriety. So to come out and acknowledge that this wasn't the case and tell the story, it really is huge. And I just can't even imagine the amount of courage that this really took. So when I was listening to this podcast, now, if you don't know who Dax Shepherd is, he's an actor and he's married to Kristen Bell. I'm going to try to show you a picture of him in just a second, just in case you're not sure who he is. He's been in several movies. He's been in the movie, the remake of the old movie Chips. He was in, let's see, I've got a list here. Hey, Weston. He was in the movie Chips. He was in Bless This Mess, Spin the Wheel, which was a show, and then El Camino Christmas, just several movies you may have seen him in. Let me just go ahead and see if I can show you his picture here, because that might make it all clear to you who he is. But most recently, he has a podcast called Armchair Expert, and this is where he actually sort of talked about this relapse, was on his podcast. And you can find that, and I highly suggest you listen to it. I'll put the link in the description, but the podcast is called Armchair Expert. Let's see if we can look at his picture here. So as you can see, this is him and his wife. So I knew when you saw his picture, you might realize who that was, and you've probably seen him in things before. Let's see. Okay, so I want to talk to you guys about 10 hugely crucial lessons that I took from listening to him talk about this relapse. And I'm going to break it down I'm going to give you 5 crucial lessons about the actual relapse, and even more importantly, 5 lessons about sort of how he got himself out of this relapse. And at the time when he talked about on this podcast, he said he had about 7 days sober. So just the fact that he could talk about this as gracefully as he did is just completely impressive to me, because I don't know how many of you out there know what it's like to come off of pain pills, but it's pretty physically and emotionally horrible. And so just to be able to just compose yourself well enough to talk about this, besides the courage that it took, it's just amazing. And so I think we would all do ourselves a favor to really take a look at what he talked about, dissect it a little bit, because there's so many really important lessons there. So let's start with the lessons about the actual relapse. The first thing that really stood out to me when he started talking about the relapse was when and how the relapse happened. So there were several things that kind of culminated together, and that was he had some injuries and he had an accident, a motorcycle accident, some other injuries. And also during this time, his father was sick and then ultimately died. And so he's going through this loss, this grief, this huge amount of stress with his father. And he also had this pain issue going on. And when you really combine the two things together, in my mind, I would say, wow, that really is the perfect storm that would make anyone vulnerable to relapse, because you're in pain, you're under a massive amount of stress, and that really does sort of make your skin get a little thinner. I guess I would call it your recovery skin. It takes your shield down tremendously, because you're using all of your willpower to manage those things. Just being in pain really eats through your willpower, and then managing the stress and trying to put on a good face and be helpful for his father, and then manage everything else in his life. You know, some of you know that I talk about willpower on this channel and how it really is like gas in the gas tank. And when you add those 2 huge, massive things onto a person who's already in recovery, who's already managing so many things, it's like putting a hole in the willpower gas tank, and eventually you just run out. And most people are much more prone to addiction in the first place when they're going through some kind of grief or loss. It's any kind of unwanted loss of any sort. It doesn't even have to be a loved one. It can be loss of dream, loss of a job, loss of a marriage, loss of a really close friendship, anything like that. When you're going through that, it puts you sort of biologically, it changes your neurochemistry and puts you at a more higher risk vulnerability for addiction and or relapse. So how it happened is completely understandable. That's not me making an excuse for him, but it is me saying, I get it. Like, wow, that's a lot, and that would stress any human being past the point. So the next thing I want to talk about is how the process of the relapse, and the way he described it was so typical of how a relapse might happen with someone who has a substantial amount of recovery, because you got to remember at this point, he had years of recovery under his belt. He had worked a very solid program, from my understanding, a 12-step program. He had done all the things. He was journaling, had support groups. I believe he had a sponsor. All these things were in place. And so when you really truly have recovery, relapse doesn't just happen super quickly. It kind of, I call it the long con or the long game. The addiction usually, when you're in a situation, works on you, because you see, it doesn't just say go out and use, it gets you to take a step closer to it, or it gets you to take a step away from maybe some of your recovery supports that are holding you solid. And that's exactly what happened in the case of Dax Shepard, and the pain pills is what he actually relapsed on. So he talked about being in pain and feeling like he needed to take some pain pills. And I think he talked initially about how he called someone in his recovery support and said, listen, I'm in a lot of pain. I got to go to work all day. I need something. And whoever he called told him, he said, well, okay, you can take 2, whatever it is, but then you got to call your doctor. You got to get a legit prescription if you really need it. And you got to tell your wife, and you got to have her hold them for you. And I'm going to talk about that holding thing here in just a second. But initially, he's trying at least to go through the right steps. He's calling someone. He's being honest and upfront about it. And so he does that. He gets a prescription. He has the wife hold them. And then everything's sort of going okay with that. But then he's in a situation where he's taking care of his dad. He doesn't have the prescription because his wife has it, but his dad is being prescribed this same thing. And he talks about how he took the pain medicine, same pain medicine his dad had. And when he first did, he told himself, like, well, I have a prescription for this. I just don't have mine because my wife has it. Just all that sort of, I call it that additive thinking is the best way I know how to describe it. It's that way we talk ourselves into things. We justify things. And so to me, that probably, in what he shared, of course, I don't know the whole story. There may be more to it, but with what he shared, I would say that's when the first lapse actually happened, because it's really about the secrecy and the dishonesty, which we're going to talk a little bit more about as we go through talking about this relapse, because that is the key problem of this whole addiction and what went on in this situation and story. So, a lot of times people who are in recovery, maybe they do have to have a surgery and they do have to take some medicine. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they've relapsed. But when you move into this secrecy, lying, hiding it in the darkness thing, that's when you've shifted out of, okay, I was taking this prescription that I'm prescribed like I'm supposed to, into this sort of sketchy addiction type area. And he talks about that very openly and clearly when he shares in his podcast, the Armchair Expert. So he talks about that lapse. And there were a few other sort of, I call them lapses, which are like these contained, abbreviated kind of relapses. And that leads to the third huge thing that I want to talk about this relapse specifically, which is those kind of lapses which don't get out of control, which nothing bad happens, no one finds out. I call those like manageable lapses. And those, in my mind, are the absolute worst thing that can happen, because it makes you think, I got this. Nothing terrible happened. I didn't hurt anybody. I didn't use excessively. And that's really where we start to go downhill, because it's working. And I usually tell my clients to say, listen, if you relapse, I love you. I don't mean this mean, but I hope something really bad happens to you. Except for I don't want you to get killed or anybody else or anything like that. But I hope it ain't good, because if it does work, and it's not like it can't ever work, because it does work sometimes, but if it does work, that's really the worst, because then you start thinking, I got this. That's the worst, because then we go all the way back in our thinking. We start taking back the powerlessness, we start secret keeping, hiding, and then the whole thing really escalates from there. So you can see how we had this sort of grief, loss, pain combo led to some lapsing. That lapsing led to overconfidence. And then a fourth thing that stood out to me about this particular story with Dax Shepard is that you may be thinking to yourself, especially because I know we have a lot of families that watch this channel trying to learn about addiction because they have a loved one addicted. You might think, well, how did this go on so long without the people around him knowing? And what I can tell you about that is a lot of that is because of what he actually relapsed on, which was pain pills. It's a lot easier to get away, especially in the beginning, with a relapse on pain pills, because people on pain pills, unless it's really excessive, and that's usually pretty far in the game, they don't look intoxicated. They're not slurred. They don't smell funny. You don't really detect that they're off. In fact, a lot of times for people in the beginning of pain pill use, they look more on their game. They're more social. They have more energy. They might get employee of the month or student of the year or something. So you're not necessarily going to detect it. So for all of you that are thinking, like, how did his family and friends not see that? Most of the time, family and friends don't see this particular type of addiction or this particular type of relapse until it gets pretty far in. And most of the time, people see pain pill addiction in the money. That's where you're going to start to see it first, is there's going to be all these money inconsistencies. You're going to see that usually before you see it in the behavior. The fifth thing I want to talk about is when he talks some about his thinking. And this is what I love about his sharing his story. He's just so honest, not about just what happened, but the important part here and the helpful part here isn't about what happened, but what his thinking was all along the way. And as you guys know who watch this channel all the time, we talk so much about the psychology of addiction, because that's what's important. That is what's crucial for you to learn. And he does a fantastic job of really just being so transparent about his thinking. And he was shared in his podcast about how he felt like, I got this. This is manageable. I'm not hurting anybody. I'm still doing the dishes. I'm doing these interviews. Everything's fine. I'm keeping it together. Hey, Grind and Shine Recovery. Thanks for joining us. And so he talks about that pretty openly, about his thinking about that. But at the same time, he also acknowledges that he had stopped journaling. And part of the reason why he had stopped journaling, which he had done sort of religiously, as he describes it, for years, was because he couldn't write the truth in his journals, because he was too afraid that would be found out, and he didn't want to tell the truth in the journals. So at the same time, he's telling himself, it's manageable. I got this. I'm not hurting anybody. I'm keeping my life together. The unmanageability part really comes in. It's the secrecy and the lying, which then leads to loneliness and isolation, because when you're keeping secrets like that, no matter how many people you have around that love you and care about you, you can't receive that love and care the same way, because you really don't feel like they know who you are, because you have this secret part of you hidden. And so it doesn't allow that love and connection to come through, because it's kind of like you're just faking it, because you have this big wall built between you and everyone else. And that then leads to further and further and further sickness and addiction, because connection is the cure for addiction. And when you're actively keeping all those secrets, you cannot allow that connection to come in. So those are the 5 big lessons that stood out to me about the relapse. Now I'd like to move on to the 5 big lessons that stood out to me about the recovery. And this is where I find it really helpful, and where I'm really most impressed by what he talked about. The first thing that stood out to me was just the humility involved in him sharing this, and him not just saying, hey, I had a relapse, but sharing his personal thoughts about it, how he felt on the inside, the fact that he used with his dad. I mean, these are some really vulnerable, personal moments. And humility truly is the key to recovery. I usually tell people, you don't have to really have anything but one thing to get recovery, and that's humility. You don't have to have money. You don't have to have friends. You don't have to have a fancy treatment center, but you do have to have humility. And he definitely, you can see that all throughout this podcast where he's talking about what's going on. Hey, let's see. It's Dr. Annette Sabrahal. I can't quite say your name, but thank you for joining us. We're glad to have you here. So you can see that the humility really shows through, which is the first step towards digging your way out of the relapse. Now, the second thing that he talked about several different times in the podcast was he talked about this feeling of, if I tell it, if I acknowledge it, does that mean I have to start over? And so let me give you a little bit of backstory here. For people who work a 12-step recovery program, the tradition is this. The tradition is when you first get clean and sober, the first thing you do is you pick up this, what they call a white chip, which stands for, it's called a surrender chip. But basically, it's like I'm surrendering to this. I want to be better. It's kind of like day one, step one sort of thing. And when you have a relapse, in a 12-step program, the tradition would be to go and pick up another one of these white chips. So for someone that has weeks, months, years to have to go back in front of their group and pick up this white chip, in some ways, it's extremely therapeutic because it says, this addiction is so powerful. And I'm not trying to manage it anymore. I surrender. I'm not trying to be sneaky or lie or hide anymore. It's like, okay, I give up. That's it. And give up, not in a bad way, but in a good way. Like, I'm not trying to manage this anymore. I'm letting it go, basically, is what it means. In a lot of ways, that's very therapeutic. But in some other ways, I think it can be pretty problematic, because if you're someone who's worked so hard and you've gained all this ground, it's tremendously hard, number one, it feels like defeat to have to walk up there and get that white chip. But also it feels like, do I have to start all over? Do I have to start at step one with my sponsor? Do I have to, does it mean I'm back on day one? And that can be a really touchy, complicated issue for people, especially for someone who has a little bit of sober time or a good amount of sober time under their belt, because it gets you to what I call the efforts. Well, if I've already screwed it up and I've already relapsed and I've got to start over, I might as well go all the way. And he talks about this real clearly when he tells his story of relapse, because he talks about, well, I might as well just go out and drink and use Coke because I haven't done that. But if I'm starting all over, if I've already messed it up, might as well not waste this relapse. That's such a tricky thought process to guard against. And here's what I would tell Dax, what I would tell anyone in this situation, and that is, no one or nothing can take away your recovery time. If you had 5 years, you may relapse, but you cannot undo those 5 years. You cannot unknow what you know. And so, yeah, you may not have moved forward. So I like to say, if you have 5 years and you lapse today, you don't get 5 years one day. You don't get that day. But if you get back on it the next day, then on that next day, if you're sober, you get 5 years and that next day. So then it's 5 years in one day. That's how I talk to my clients about it. And that's not me letting you off the hook for a relapse. That's not me saying, oh, you're all good. But it is really important to try to sort of fight against that effort kind of thinking. Because the worst thing you can do is just get so down on yourself to think, I've screwed it all up. I've ruined everything. Because it just makes you want to throw in the towel and give in to addiction completely. And that's the worst thing that you can do. Hey, Ann, so glad you're joining us. So do you have to start over? There are some things that you do need to sort of back up and do, which is figure out what went wrong, analyze the relapse, talk to your sponsor. If your sponsor thinks you need to rework some steps, then you rework those steps, but you do not have to start all over. And even when you hear Dax Shepard tell this story, he's got 7 days sober, but you can hear those years of recovery. It is still there, very alive and well. And even when he was using, I guarantee you, it was like in the back of his head, just bothering him because he knew what was up. And I always say, it's like you can go back up there and use, but it won't be the same again, because once you know the truth, you cannot unknow the truth. And I know that during that time he was using, he was struggling with it. He was fighting it because that little voice, that recovery voice, was talking to him, and he knew ultimately it was going to end badly and what was going to have to happen. He was just trying to probably like stave it off for as long as possible. The third thing I want to talk about in the recovery, or the sort of the comeback part of this relapse story, is that he chose to reach out. He doesn't say exactly why in the podcast I listened to, why he chose to reach out and to come clean. And I think what he says is the first thing he did was decide that he was gonna, I can't remember if he came clean to someone in recovery first, or to his wife at the same time as the co-host of his podcast. But that was pretty early on. He told those two people, and he said, this isn't going well, I'm not managing this, and he gave the rest of his stash or whatever he had left and said, I've got a problem, I need some help. And I don't know what led up to him doing that. He didn't talk specifically about that, but my guess is that was his recovery in the back of his head, still at work, even though he was in a relapse. He did not have to hit bottom. He did not have to lose everything. And you guys who watch this show religiously, you know how strongly I feel about that. You don't have to lose everything. You just have to understand that you will if you don't do something about it. And he obviously did, which tells me his recovery was at play. He did not have to lose everything before he sort of, what we might call in recovery, like handed it over or came clean or whatever you want to call it. So he did the reaching out. Now, I can't remember for some reason if he called the friend or sponsor, whoever it was, in recovery, or he told the wife and the co-host first. But at any rate, whenever he told, this is the fourth thing, whenever he told this recovery friend of his what was going on, this was the recovery advice. And I love this. Don't know who your recovery friend is, but I vote for you, man. He said his advice to Dax was to admit it to his recovery supports, to admit it to his family, and then to admit it publicly. And I got to tell you, for someone in his situation, if it were me, I would fight that. I would resist that. Like, it's bad enough having to tell your family, to acknowledge it, but to be a celebrity, to have to tell the whole world, especially when you just supposedly had your 16 years sober. I mean, this is heartbreaking. So it's I know he had to have been really, this is what I have to do? But that truly was the answer here. Does he have to start over? No, I don't think he has to start over. Does he need to tell everyone? I think he does. And here's why. Because addiction can only live in secrecy and darkness. And when you turn the light on it, it doesn't live anymore. It creates the kind of accountability, honesty. It keeps those secrets. It takes those secrets. It's like secrets are like little splinters that get infected. They're inside of you, and it just takes that infection out. As painful as it is, it really is the healing process. And I cannot tell you how much I admire the courage it took to do that, and how much I know that was exactly what needed to happen for him to turn this relapse around. Because if he would just told, let's say, his sponsor and his group, yeah, you can do that. He's working a program called Alcoholics Anonymous, from what I can tell. So do you have to tell the world? No, because you can be anonymous. But that keeps the secret alive. That keeps the shame alive. And if he had just told, let's say, his sponsor or his recovery friends, he would have still been hiding the secrets from his family, friends, and the world. And as long as that was going on, he was going to stay sick really and truly. He would have kept trying to backpedal and cover tracks. And really, by just opening it up and putting it out there, that allows for the healing to start. So, I mean, that was perfect advice and took a tremendous amount of courage to do. The fifth lesson, the fifth recovery lesson, but the 10th overall lesson here that I want to bring up is the fact that not only did he talk about what happened, but you could hear him, especially talking to his co-host and acknowledging how he had lied to her, how he had been gaslighting, and the position that he put her in. So it's just that 100% acknowledgement, not just of what I did, but how what I did affected the people that I care about. And that really, in my mind, is an amends making process. It's an acknowledgement. And so that takes that I'm acknowledging it, I'm admitting, I'm telling it to you. And then immediately it's like I'm healing this relationship I have with the people around me, that amends process that's just so important to get those relationships back intact. So overall, I got to say, thank you so much for sharing this. There are so many lessons. I'm telling you, I was listening to this and I was writing these lessons down and I narrowed it down to 10 for you. There's a lot more in there. So please, if you haven't listened to this, listen to it, because there's a lot to learn here. We'll take a couple of comments right quick. Anna says, this topic is so important. Do you feel this is an episode I can share with my addict who is 3 months into her recovery from drug addiction? That is a great question, Anne. It just depends on the relationship you have with your addict and how you bring it up. You can say, man, I heard this is awesome. You might enjoy it. And you can sort of mention it casually and then walk off and leave it and say, hey, if you want me to send it to you, I'll send it to you. But don't force it. Don't come at it like it's this lesson or in your face. So a lot of it's like not just, the question really isn't like, can I share it, but how you share it. That's what's important. Let's see, we're so excited when they stop using and within 6 months they're back because they begin to think they're invisible. Just one last time always gets them. I agree with you here. And I think that's one of the reasons why it was so very important that that he publicly announced this, because that truly is going to hold the accountability in place and hopefully help them get and keep the brakes on that. Addiction can only live in darkness. So true. Thank you, CF. Appreciate you watching that. And thank you, everyone who joined us. This was sort of an impromptu, but I was really inspired when I listened to this podcast. I hope you all go out there and listen to it. I'll put the link in the description, and I'll see you guys next week.